It's a great privilege for me to give these 3 talks at this wonderful meeting. In each of my 3 talks, I'm going to try to do what John Stott called double listening. We have to listen to the world in the light of the Bible, and we have to listen to the Bible in the light of the world. So this is what I'm trying to do in each talk. In the first talk, we're going to be focusing on the issues, ethical issues at the beginning and the ending of life, and looking at changes in attitudes. What are the deep themes in society that underline the recent challenges and developments in ethics? And how does a Christian understanding of what it means to be human provide valuable and helpful and practical ways of responding? In the second talk, we'll look at the global environmental crisis, about climate change, and ask how a Christian understanding of creation and of our human solidarity with the rest of creation should underpin our practical engagement. And in the final talk, we'll be looking at the future, at the new challenges raised by advances in genetics, in neuroscience, in computing, robotics, artificial intelligence. What kind of world is technology creating for our children? And how can we relate the unchanging and the ancient truths of the Christian faith to all the amazing, mind-boggling possibilities that technology is offering? First, I want to say a little bit about my background. Can I have the first PowerPoint? I have spent most of my professional career as a neonatologist. Is that advancing? There we are. So this is the environment in which I am very happy. This is my home inside an intensive care unit with tiny, tiny little babies. Some of these babies as little as 22 or 23 weeks, weighing 500 grams, literally fitting in the palm of my hand. And some bigger babies, but with major brain problems or congenital malformations. And the question is, how do we care for these tiny and threatened individuals? There's a baby at 23 weeks gestation. The only chance of survival for these babies is through sophisticated technology. Of course, not all the babies do well, and there are major concerns that some babies will survive with significant disability, such as cerebral palsy or learning difficulties. But in fact, the large majority of even very small babies do well, but the cost is high. It costs in the UK about £2,000, €2,000 per baby per day, and the total cost may be £100,000 to ensure the survival of one baby, all paid for by the state. Presumably, as a society, we have decided that these tiny babies are worth saving. They are worth spending thousands and thousands of pounds. This is my hand and one of the babies on the baby unit. But just one floor away in the hospital, is the fetal medicine unit, and here there is another sophisticated, technologically advanced facility where pregnant mothers from all over London and the south of England are referred to identify abnormalities of the fetus. And when there are significant problems found, late abortions, or what we call feticides, are carried out in our hospital in London, sometimes at 28 weeks, 30 weeks, 32 weeks, even 36 weeks. In the UK, the law allows an abortion to be carried out at any time until term. And in my work as a doctor, I was frequently called from the neonatal unit to travel one floor to the fetal medicine unit to discuss with a mother who was considering destroying the baby in her womb, and she had asked to speak to a pediatrician. And the baby in her womb is considerably stronger and bigger than many of the babies we are struggling to save one floor below. And then you say, how is it possible in one hospital and in one state-supported system to have these contradictory activities happening? And it was experiences like that which increasingly forced me to engage with medical ethics. I felt, as Christ had called me into the medical world, it was my responsibility to try to wrestle, to try to understand. I had the great privilege of being a close friend of John Stott, very famous preacher and Bible teacher of the last century, and he became a kind of spiritual father to me, as he was to many other people. And it was his example, not only of the way he taught, but also the way he lived. He modeled double listening and thoughtful, compassionate, respectful engagement in society with secular leaders and thinkers. And so it was his vision and example which has motivated me for the rest of my life. And the reason I'm standing here, by God's grace, at a human level, is because of his example. So I dedicate these 3 lectures to his memory. He died about 10 years ago. So I want to talk now about technology at the beginning of life, or reproductive technology. So we have now many new ways of creating human lives. There is in vitro fertilization, there is embryo selection, there is gamete donation, giving sperm or egg, there is surrogate pregnancy. And now across the world, this accounts for about 4 to 5 out of 100 of every births. And more than 8 million children and adults are alive today because of this technology. In doing a bit of background research for my visit, I found that since 2008, the rate of reproductive technology here in Spain has increased by 50%. And in 2018, there were nearly 150,000 cycles of IVF and 34,000 of intrauterine insemination. So Spain is the largest European provider of reproductive technology services in Europe and the fourth largest in the world. I didn't know that. It's interesting. Why is Spain? Why has Spain taken reproductive technology so seriously? And why is it so massive here? Apparently, Spain is also one of the world's most popular destinations for people from other countries to come to have reproductive technology here. But at the same time that tens of thousands of babies are born through technology, about 100,000 abortions are recorded every year in Spain. So we see again these contradictions. On the one hand, huge amount of resources to create life, to create new life, even for people who have infertility for many years. And at the same time, we see large numbers of women who choose, for whatever reason, to destroy an unborn baby. With regard to euthanasia and assisted suicide, as is well known, this was legalized in Spain in 2020. And the law states that euthanasia is available to those with full capacity to act and decide, who suffer from a serious and incurable disease, or suffering from a serious, chronic, and disabling disease. And of course, there are a number of lawyers here in the room, and you will know immediately the problem that a law like that has, because words like serious, incurable, suffering, disabling cannot be given a precise, quantitative, or legal meaning. And so there is a huge problem of definition. And in the end, this is a very subjective decision. And I'm afraid if the history of other countries across the world that have legalized this kind of law, to begin with, the numbers are very small, but it seems progressively, year on year, it increases as there becomes a greater awareness that this is a legal possibility. The available statistics from the first year indicate that about 336 people from Spain requested euthanasia, and about 180 cases were performed. And something I found very striking is that organs were donated to other people in 28 cases of euthanasia. And there were 68 individual organ transplants from people who committed, who agreed to euthanasia. So that is a very interesting phenomenon. I know that Spain prides itself on having a very high rate of organ donation, but I see there a huge threat for the future, because what will be promoted is as an altruistic suicide. You know, you're old, you have had your life, you want to die. Well, we can help you die, but think how much good you will do when you die. As you choose to die, many other people will live. Isn't that amazing? What goodness you can do. And do you see how that is such a twisted understanding of Christian love? So that's something we will come back to. But what is clear from other countries is that the reasons that people give for euthanasia is not mainly to do with pain. When the campaigners are campaigning for euthanasia, they give examples of agonizing suffering and terrible, untreatable pain. But actually, if you look at what is happening in countries around the world, the examples, the commonest example is given, and these are statistics from Oregon in the state in the USA, which has had legally assisted suicide for 25 years. They say the commonest reason is less able to engage in activities that make life enjoyable. That was 94% said that. 93% said losing autonomy. 53% said burden on family, friends and carers. And 30% said inadequate pain control or concern. And despite the fact that this has been there legal for 25 years, the graph is very striking. It is going up year on year on year. And so we need to ask, what is it that is driving this in our society? But you know, these are not just philosophical and theoretical issues. We must always remember that nearly all issues in bioethics start with human pain. They start with people who suffer and struggle and bleed and are frightened. So we must never reduce medical ethics just to cold theology or abstract moral principles. Our first duty, if we are followers of Christ, is to empathize. It is to enter into the pain, to seek to understand, because empathy is the way of Jesus. The incarnation is an act of cosmic empathy. God entered into the experience of being human. And second, these are not just issues out there in society. These are issues in here, in this room. I don't know anything about all of you, and yet I know that infertility affects about 1 in 7 couples. So I can guarantee there are many people here who have been affected by infertility. Some of you young people, you will be affected by infertility even though you don't know it. I know that about 1 in 4 of all women in Spain will have an abortion in their lifetime. And therefore I can guarantee there are many people in this room who have been personally affected by abortion. Someone in your family, someone known to you, maybe you yourself. And for every woman that is involved, there is a man. So these are not just issues out there, they affect all of us. Many people in this room may be affected by genetic conditions. You have watched a loved one die. You are worried about your own future. You're wondering whether you're going to have a slow and painful death and whether suicide would be a better option. So this affects all of us. We all share this because of our humanity. So I want to now move on to think about 4 themes in society. Can we move on to the next slide? I can't advance it, sorry. You've got it. Okay. I'm going to look at 4 deep themes. Now, these particularly reflect, I think, what is happening in liberal societies, and different societies have different elements of this with different forces, but I think they are relevant to all of us. And I see these almost like acid. This is acid, which is slowly seeping through society and which is slowly destroying traditional structures. So here are 4 themes. First, I define the meaning and the direction of my own life. This is what philosophers call the principle of autonomy. I am the creator of my own life. Second, I define what right and wrong, good and evil means. So that would be called moral relativism. Third, suffering. I'll just move on. Third, suffering, hardship, struggle, they're all meaningless. Worse than that, they're dehumanizing. They make me less than human. And then finally, whatever the problems are, technology is going to solve them and build a better world. That's the techno-optimism that says technology is the solution. All four of these are complicated, and each would require a separate talk to deal with them in detail, but I can only give a rather superficial overview. But I'm going to go through each four. Next slide. Sorry, could you advance on next slide? There we go. So I define the meaning and the direction of my own life. This is an idea which is so powerful today. I have the right to choose. Whatever I want to do, I choose and I define my own life. And if I can control where I live, how I spend my money, how we spend our time, then why cannot I choose how to, whether to create a baby or whether to destroy a baby? Or if I choose I want to live or I want to die, it is my life. Philosophers call this the principle of autonomy. It's a word derived from the Greek autonomos, and basically it means I make my own laws. I am my own ruler. And it's the principle behind patient choice. It's enshrined in medical and legal guidelines. It's the patient who's at the center, choosing and controlling all the treatments. And behind this is the concept of radical liberal individualism. I create the meaning and the purpose of my own life. I am writing my story. It's no one else's story. And Ronald Dworkin is an influential American legal philosopher, and he said this: at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Freedom is the cardinal absolute requirement of self-respect. No one treats his life as having any intrinsic importance unless he insists on leading that life himself, not being ushered by others. So that's the first one. Second, next slide, yeah, there we go. I define what is right and wrong, good and evil. A biblical Christian understanding of morality, and indeed of all traditional religions, is that good and evil, right and wrong, are external to us. In other words, as we grow up as individuals in the world, we discover the meaning of right and wrong. It is external, objective. It's a part of the way that the world is. And this view is often described as moral realism. But in modern secular thinking, there is a growing belief that this idea of external, objective morality is a myth. Morality is just a game which is invented by our clever human minds in order to increase our chances of survival on the African savannah. And this way of thinking has a variety of philosophical names like moral subjectivism, emotivism, or moral relativism. We pretend that certain actions are good, other actions are evil, but it's just a social game. Whenever we say that something is good, what you really mean is, I like that. Following the philosopher Nietzsche, many argue that morality is just a way that the powerful people oppress the weak people. It's all about human power. And the only ultimate reality is physics. And when it comes to physics, good and evil makes no sense. Of course, in reality, our society, secular societies, are deeply confused about all this. There are some kinds of evil that most people view as objectively wrong, like sexual or physical abuse of children, like genocide, like war crimes, what is happening in Ukraine. People say, yes, that is just wrong. But in other areas of morality, like abortion or euthanasia, moral subjectivism rules. How dare you say to me that whatever I choose is right or wrong? Next slide. Our modern society is losing the belief that suffering, hardship and struggle can have any positive value or meaning. And worse, actually these things dehumanize me. They make me less than human. They threaten the very meaning and dignity of my life. So for many modern people, the most important goal is finding ways of eliminating suffering and hardship. And this leads to a techno-optimist view of the future in which advanced technology is going to make everything easy, everything frictionless. Every desire, every longing, every interest will be satisfied instantly, effortlessly. Frustration, struggle, boredom, they're all going to be banished. We'll all be free to exercise our choices and fulfill our dreams. We'll come back to this theme in the third talk when we look at the future of humanity, but for now it's worth noticing how important this is in the debate about death and dying. The most important goal is just stop any unpleasantness. And for many modern people, anesthesia is the ideal death. I just don't want to experience anything. Quick, painless, anxiety-free extinction. Next slide. Theme 4. Whatever the problems are, technology can solve them and build a better world. Our final theme is the rise of techno-optimism. Medical and biotechnology are seen as capable of providing practical fixes for all kinds of problems. It's a theme we're going to return to. But if you're interested in the history of ideas, I think this is very, very striking. In the 20th century, many people thought technology was the main threat to humankind. There was the Holocaust, the machine gun, the First World War, Hiroshima. Science was the threat, was going to destroy us. But in the 21st century, we had a complete change in attitudes. Now, science and technology is our savior. Technology is going to answer whatever the problems. Religion and politics have proved to be futile and powerless to bring lasting change. Now it's technology that is going to solve our problems. So here are the 4 deep themes of contemporary society, but now let's turn to Christian responses. Next slide. And again, next slide. So Biblical Christians are moral realists. The Bible teaches us that good and evil is external to us. And so biblical ethics, the way we're called to treat one another, comes from biblical anthropology. And time again, I have found the deeper and the richer our understanding of what it means to be human, the better we find ways of addressing ethical issues. We need to develop a deep, rich understanding of what it means to be human. Next slide. And so here are three foundations. Again, they're all familiar to you, but it's worth just briefly saying. First of all, we are made, every one of us, in God's image. And each human life is not only a gift, it is a reflection of God's own character and being. Human beings are godlike beings. And that means that we don't explain ourselves. However much you examine our DNA or the way the brain is wired, you will never understand what it means to be human, because we are a reflection, a map. We map onto another kind of reality entirely, which is God himself, the character and the being of God. And so the significance and the value of each human life comes not from our abilities, from our function. It comes from the stuff of our being, from the way that God called us into existence. Each human life is like a masterpiece, a unique masterpiece of irreplaceable value. And our dignity and our significance come from our godlikeness. We heard this morning, our brother was expounding from Psalm 8, and one literal translation of the Hebrew says that each human being is lacking a very little of God. Lacking a very little of God. It's an extraordinary statement to say that human beings could be so wonderful, so profound. To destroy a human life is not only a terrible evil perpetrated on that individual and on society, it is in a sense to spit in the face of God, to violate everything that the image represents. Next one, we are made out of dust. So we need to balance these two things. Yes, on the one hand, human beings are wonderful. They are lacking a very little of God, and yet we are made out of dust. We are made out of the same stuff as everything else on the planet. The Hebrew word for human, Adam, is derived from the word for ground, Adama. And in both English and Spanish, human, or humano, is derived from humus, the compost heap. We are created in solidarity with the rest of the physical universe, and we share the limitations of the physical universe. And that means we are designed to be physical, dependent, frail, and vulnerable. Dependence on other human beings is not an alien, subhuman, undignified condition. You and I came into the world utterly and totally dependent on the love of other people, and they were other people that you did not choose. Then we go through a phase of our life when other people depend on us. We protect them, care for them, feed them, pay for them. But then most of us will end our physical lives totally dependent on the love and care of others. We will need other people to feed us and protect us and care for us. And from a Christian perspective, this is not a terrible, degrading, inhuman reality. Dependence is part of the narrative, part of the story of human lives that have been given us. And even God in human form experiences the complete dependence on others that being human entails. And please note that frailty, weakness, and dependence are not a consequence of the fall. This is creation. This is the way it was meant to be. Of course, these problems are exacerbated and contaminated by the evil, but they ultimately derive from creation. Next one. And we are made into families. Every human person is created with bonds. So whereas secular thought regards this individual, I make my life, I make my choices, Christian thinking is always we are bonded together. I came into the world locked into a network of relations I did not choose, with a mother and a father and grandparents and siblings and aunts and uncles and friends and carers. And, we are all of us deeply related. Geneticists say every single person on the planet, every single human being is genetically related to everyone else. So did you recognize, if you look to the left or the right as you are sitting there, you are looking at a distant relative. Every single person in this room is a relative. And when you walk through the center of Madrid, every person you meet is a relative. And that's why we're called to treat even the stranger and the immigrant with gentleness and with respect and love, because we are family. And in any family, the strong have a duty to protect and care for the weak. To be called into a family is to be called to share the burdens of the life which God has given us, the burdens which come from our creation out of dust. And so when I hear people say, I don't want to be a burden, I hear many Christian people say that, but it's wrong. If anybody ever says to you, I don't want to be a burden, you must say to them, you are wrong. You are designed to be a burden to me, and I am designed to be a burden to you. And the life that God has given us is mutual burdensomeness. That's why Paul says, bear one another's burdens. So it's not possible for me in this short talk to address many of the complex ethical issues about reproductive technology, but I am convinced that as Christian people, we are called to protect human life in all stages of development, right from the earliest stages of embryonic life all the way through till death from natural causes. We don't have the right to introduce death into the womb through abortion, and we don't have the right to introduce death at the end of life through suicide or euthanasia. But this does not mean that we have a duty to prolong life as long as possible. There is a time to say enough is enough, to withhold or withdraw life-sustaining treatment and allow death to occur naturally. So Christian healthcare professionals, and there are many in this room, we are called to use all our skill and energy to fight against death, to hold death away, whilst at the same time trying to recognize the point at which death changes from an enemy into a strange kind of healing. And at that point, we take our hands away. We allow death to occur. It seems to me that as Christians we don't welcome or hasten death, but we recognize there is a time to allow it to occur. And that is the fundamental insight which lies behind the development of the modern palliative care movement, which started in the UK with a Christian physician, Cicely Saunders. The philosophy of palliative care is neither to hasten death nor to hold death away. Instead, we allow death to occur naturally at its own timing, whilst we focus on maximizing the quality of life of the dying person in the last hours, days, and weeks. As one of Cicely Saunders' slogans put it, not only will we help you to die well, we will help you to live before you die. So as I come to the close, we're going to have a time for question and answer, but as I'm finishing soon, how do we respond practically as Christian believers? How do we respond in a society which is increasingly moving away from a Christian understanding of these matters? It's an issue I'm going to return in more detail in the third talk, but let me make some brief comments now. Next slide. So we're called to have a responsibility as salt and light, to act both as a preservative, to penetrate society, to oppose corruption, and to act as a light which penetrates into dark places, shining truth and light into areas which other people wish to keep concealed. Next slide. Although we have a duty to uphold a biblical understanding of the value of human life, it seems we must engage in an empathic and a positive way when we engage with secular people. We must recognize the pain and the fear and the meaninglessness which drives people to abortion or euthanasia. I'm afraid in the UK and especially the USA, so often the public voice of Christians on bioethics seems negative, uncaring, and judgmental. This is evil. This is against God's will. Doctors are murderers. We are calling down judgment. This kind of language is so contrasts with the language of Christ. Christ used that language, but only with the Pharisees, only with the church leaders, the Jewish leaders. When he spoke to the pagan people, he spoke with compassion. He spoke with empathy. So it seems to me, next slide, whenever we say that something is wrong, we must immediately go on to say, and here is a better way. So our message is positive, it's encouraging, it's practical. So what is that better way? Next slide. Well, for the problem of the unplanned or the crisis pregnancy, I want to really commend the role of Christian crisis pregnancy centres. I know there are several represented here. I've been the trustee of a centre in London, Crisis Pregnancy Centre, for more than 20 years, and my wife was the director of that centre for many years. And the centre provide a safe space. They provide supportive, non-judgmental counselling for women and their partners. We have over 100 people a year contacting the centre via the internet or via social media. The centres provide practical support and baby equipment for single unsupported mothers who continue the pregnancy, and counselling for women and men who are emotionally traumatized by a previous abortion. If you know someone who has had an abortion, even though other people don't know, and they are traumatized by the memory, then can I please ask you to refer or to go yourself to seek help specialized help from a crisis pregnancy center who have special recovery courses for this. Other practical steps we can take are to encourage Christians to offer themselves as adoptive parents to abandoned or disabled children. This is a wonderful move that is happening in the UK. We are now having many young couples and even single women who are choosing to register themselves as adoptive parents. It's even happening within our own family, with our own children. And it's a wonderful expression of practical compassion. This is something that Christians have done right from the time of the early church. They have rescued orphans and abandoned children. And actually, there is a real opportunity for this now. Wouldn't it be wonderful if in Spain, Christians were known as people who were caring for children, who were demonstrating in their lives, rescuing abandoned children. We can fight to improve support for families with disabled children, and we can encourage the use of reproductive technology that does not destroy embryos. Again, a trend in the UK is to have so-called natural cycle IVF, which does not involve use of hormones, it doesn't involve freezing embryos. And many Christians are choosing to go for this kind of technology, which is much more ethical. And at the end of life, next slide, we can be encouraging and supporting palliative care and the work of hospices, arguing in favor of improving the quality and the availability of end-of-life care, and helping Christians, believers, on what it means to die well. And we need to oppose this simplistic belief that suffering and hardship is meaningless. Because God's plan for this age is not to abolish suffering, it's to redeem it. It's to bring strange and unexpected blessing and healing out of suffering and pain. And our calling as followers of Christ is to be there with those who suffer. And so, final slide, I think, suffering is not a question which demands an answer. It's not a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery which demands a presence. And there is no higher calling, sisters and brothers, than to be the hands of Christ, to be the presence of Christ with those who are suffering. I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, because you just gave us many topics to think about and to reflect, and so we're going to make the question and answers. Así que para todos, yo creo que John Wyatt ha dicho muchas cosas muy interesantes que creo que se necesita mucho tiempo aún para pensar y reflexionar y un poco, digamos, coger todas las ideas, pero tenemos la oportunidad de hacer un tiempo de 15 minutos con preguntas y respuestas, ¿vale? Como sé que todos tenéis ganas de hablar con él, porque da muchas ganas de hablar con él, os voy a pedir una cosa. Vamos a tener otros tiempos donde vamos a poder hablar con John Wyatt y comentarle experiencias personales o sucesos que nos han podido traer o generar dudas o, bueno, que queramos compartir. Pero ahora lo vamos a hacer como mucho más centrado, así que os voy a pedir a aquellos que tengáis preguntas, primero que levantéis la mano, que alguien va a ir con un micro a pasaros el micro. Segundo, que por favor digáis vuestro nombre para saber quiénes sois y que hagáis la pregunta clara y concisa, ¿vale? Solo tenemos 15 minutos, entonces otras historias personales son muy bienvenidas, pero en otro momento, ¿vale? No en este. Entonces, no sé quién quiere empezar y saltar a la arena y decir la primera pregunta. Veo por allí una mano. No sé si le podéis pasar el micro o si no, si la quieres levantarte y decir en alto. ¿No mucho? She has some doubts about why the death, especially the dependence, is not the consequence of sin, but just the consequence of creation. So if you could explain a little bit more of this sentence, please.
The idea is that God chose to make us frail and vulnerable and dependent. Presumably, God could have made us powerful, dynamic, glorious. Think about the cherubim and the seraphim in Isaiah's temple, proclaiming the glory of God, and the whole of the temple is shaking with the power of their voices. But instead, God chose to make us pathetic. You think of a newborn baby. I care for newborn babies. I know how weak, how fragile, how utterly dependent they are from creation. I think, and the ultimate theological reason is we know that Jesus himself took on this dependence, both at the beginning of his life, where he is utterly dependent on the love and care of others, and at the end of his life. On the cross, he is utterly dependent. So I think that the idea has come into the mind that human beings were created perfect, and then the fall changed everything. But actually, this idea is much more a Greek idea. It is not a biblical idea. In fact, it doesn't say that the creation was perfect. The Bible says the creation was very good. And apparently in Hebrew, what that means is fit for purpose. The creation wasn't perfect, but it was fit for purpose. It was designed to do what God intended. And it seems, why did God make us so fragile, so dependent, so vulnerable? I think we know, don't we? We know that God's plan is that his glory and his power and his beauty is going to be demonstrated in weakness. Isn't that the story of the great story of the Bible? That God's power, this transformation, that where do we see the power and the glory of God most strongly? In a broken and bruised body of a man on a cross. So God's plan is to demonstrate his beauty and his power in our weakness and our dependence.
We have another, tenemos otra pregunta, por favor, si te puedes presentar.
¿Escucha? Sí. Esperanza Soler, soy matrona y veo que muchas veces hay unas circunstancias que pueden variar, ¿no? Entonces, cuando usted ha afirmado acerca de una mujer que va a abortar, que va a destruir el bebé que lleva dentro de su vientre, ¿no? Esta afirmación o esta frase, ¿usted considera que se podría generalizar en algunos casos, como por ejemplo, si esta madre lleva un niño anencéfalo, o sea, un niño que no tiene masa cerebral y que no es compatible con la vida? Este niño cuando nazca a las pocas horas va a morir y en este caso pues la mujer puede haber decidido abortar, ¿no? En un caso una malformación severa, grave, o un caso como que la madre tenga un cáncer avanzado, necesite la quimioterapia, a lo mejor esta madre tiene incluso ya más niños y ha decidido abortar. Entonces, ¿considera que esta frase tal vez debería de no ser en general para todos los casos del aborto? Solamente esto. Gracias.
Thank you for that question. And of course, over the years, in my experience, I have come across many, many tragic cases which have involved babies with very severe malformations. I've seen tragic cases of sick mothers. I've seen tragic cases of rape, pregnancy through rape, cases where the mother's life is at risk. And yet, despite all the tragedies and difficult things that I've seen, I have remained convinced that in nearly every case, it is not that to destroy a life is actually out, even when it is motivated by the best intentions, is not the best Christian way. I have seen amazing ways in which when people have chosen not to destroy life, the way that God, and they've received the right kind of loving support, I have seen amazing things. I have had the privilege of caring for many babies as a pediatrician with anencephaly, with Edwards syndrome, with a whole range of severe abnormalities. And I have seen how even a baby who lives for only a few minutes and who dies in peace in the mother's arms, that life can touch hundreds of people and can bring an amazing witness and significance. But I have also seen that where parents have taken an abortion, even out of love, it has often led to lifelong consequences of shame, of guilt, of did I do the right thing, ambivalence, and so on. So I remain convinced that there is a better way. I would never judge somebody who had an abortion because in this situation, it's not for me to judge. But I would try to offer people, with the right kind of support, there is a better way. And the only situation where it seems to me it is right to destroy the life of the baby is where the mother's life is at risk, because in this situation, the only choice you have is either you are not deciding between the mother and the baby. That is not the choice you have. The choice you have is either the mother and the baby die, or the mother lives and the baby dies. And in that situation, I think I and most Christian ethicists would agree that sadly, to take the life of the baby in order for the mother to live, you are not introducing death. Death is already there. Death is going to go one way or the other. All I can do as a doctor is direct death in one direction and not in another direction. And that is different from taking a living child and introducing death in a medical means.
Tenemos otra pregunta al final de la sala y voy a dejar aparte una pregunta más, o sea que si alguien tiene una pregunta es vuestra última oportunidad.
Hola, soy Yani y tenía una pregunta y un dato. ¿Cómo se redime el sufrimiento? ¿Qué maneras prácticas tenemos de redimir el sufrimiento? Y un dato, España tiene, en relación con lo que decía del cuidado de los niños que no tienen padres o que tienen grandes dificultades, España tiene un compromiso internacional de que ningún niño entre 0 y 3 años esté en una institución, esté institucionalizado. Y como país no somos capaces de cumplir ese reto. Y hay más de 15.000 niños institucionalizados en España. Entonces, efectivamente, creo que es precisamente uno de los retos que como iglesias podríamos afrontar.
Thanks very much. This is a very interesting question. I would encourage you to make contact with the groups in the UK who have been behind this Christian development because there is now quite a lot of experience in encouraging Christians to become adoptive parents of abandoned children. Of course, it's a very major commitment, and especially for a single person to decide to become an adoptive parent, they need to have a support group around them who will act like grandparents and siblings and create a family support network. They need to have people who will be there for them for the rest of their life, who will say, I will commit to you and I will be the grandparent for your child, whatever happens. But I think where I have seen this happening, it is a wonderful example of how from something evil, something very precious can happen. But there is now more experience in the UK, and I would be happy to put you in touch with the people who are working there.
Se lo he traducido, lo que pasa que como ha puesto el ejemplo práctico, she's telling me that she was saying how to redeem suffering, but as she explained this practical example about kids who were in foster care, that's the reason I just entered the translation about that. So sorry for...
So the question more generally, how is suffering redeemed? Well, you know, it is not for us to redeem suffering. It is God's work. It is the work of the Spirit. And it is a miraculous work which we often cannot understand. But it seems to me, from a Christian point of view, so suffering in anyone's life may cause terrible damage. It may cause bitterness, hatred, loss of faith. So suffering, the route from suffering to healing is not automatic. But I think one way of thinking about this is that it goes through the Garden of Gethsemane. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prays, Lord, if it be possible, take this cup away from me, yet, nevertheless, your will be done. And it seems to me that prayer is the prayer that unlocks the possibility of redemption, a possibility of healing. Once I am prepared to accept and say to God, your will be done, then I'm allowing the blessing to happen. This happened in my own life. I had a very severe psychiatric illness and was admitted into a locked psychiatric ward. And at one time I thought I would never again have any work again as a doctor, and I would never have any Christian ministry again. It was a very painful period, but slowly, through a process of being able to pray that prayer, nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. Your will be done. Now, by God's grace, my experience of suffering has turned into a strange gift. It was not something I wanted, but it has given me something that I can now have to share with other people. And I can see how God's blessing has been set free in my life through that very painful episode of suffering.
La última pregunta, si alguien se anima, allá al fondo, por favor, Marta. Gracias.
Hi. Would you say that it's healthy for a child to grow up in a single-parent home, especially if it's an adopted child who already has a background of instability?
Good question, but the short answer is yes, because the alternative is catastrophic. The alternative of children growing in a state system, in state orphanages, is the statistics are absolutely terrible. There are vast amounts of abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, high levels of drug use, and very high levels then of children who enter into, once they grow up, they enter into the prison system, they become drug addicts, they become homeless. This whole cycle continues. So, of course, it is not perfect, but adoption is a wonderful image, a Christian image, because, of course, we too don't deserve to be cared for, and yet God treats us as his own children. He adopts us into his family, and he loves us, and he commits himself to us. So yes, there are all kinds of problems, but it's still a better way than the alternative.